Welcome to the latest episode of Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. I'm Matthew Wynn, the podcast host, and we're in the series about mergers. We're in the series about group models. What are they? What do they mean? How do they operate? And it's great to have Shane DeGaris from Barts. Shane, why don't you start with explaining who you are, the organizations or organization that you lead, and something about your group so people can understand it as well?
Sure, Matthew. Thank you. And hi, everyone. So, Shane DeGaris, Group CEO at Barts Health in London. We've got 5 hospitals in our group, two sort of a big teaching hospital, St Bartholomew's, which is also the oldest hospital in operating from the same site in England, 900 years a year ago. We've also got the Royal London Hospital in Tower Hamlets, where I am today, and that's a huge tertiary hospital, home to London's air ambulance, major trauma, stroke, but also a huge district general hospital, DGH, wrapped up inside for Tower Hamlets. We've then got 2 DGHs, essentially one at Whipps Cross and Waltham Forest, one at Newham, and then we've got a community hospital at Mile End. And so that's 5 hospitals, a real mix of kind of the top end sort of specialist, tertiary, acute hospitals. We operate those in 4 operating units. So Barts Health's got a budget of about £2.5 billion, about 24,000 staff. And we have sort of 4 units, and each of the hospitals has got its own CEO, and they've got their own executive team within that. And the 4 hospital, we run the Royal London together with Mile End management-wise, because that's a kind of acute community combined flow. But since you've got 4 CEOs, 4 exec teams, those 4 CEOs report into me directly, and along with the group executive directors, the group directors that report to me, chief finance officer, chief people officer, etc., make up the executive and then sit on the trust board. That operating unit's been in place since my predecessor, Dame Alwyn Williams, was brought in when the trust was in special measures back in 2015. And in fact, a lot of what we see today is from the excellent work she put in, which I'm sure we can talk about in the podcast, around kind of what were some of the drivers of change to make it easier for staff and for patients to kind of navigate such a big beast.
Big beast indeed. 24,000 staff. I won't ask you how many of those you know by sight and name, because that would be embarrassing for all listeners. But so 5, and were they, Shane, just so people understand this, were any of those separate entities as NHS trusts previously to then becomes, because you talk about Barts board, so they're all under the Barts NHS organisation, aren't they?
Yeah, so it's unlike some other groups that you'll be chatting to, these are not kind of virtual. So Barts Health is a merged organisation, fully merged, and it involved Barts and the London NHS Trust, which was Barts and the Royal London, which was in place in itself as a merger of St Barts and the Royal London many years ago, but Barts and the London NHS Trust, Whipps Cross NHS Trust, and Newham University Hospitals NHS. So that was all brought together a good few years ago. So it's a fully merged trust operating as a group, which of course does make it different than other colleagues I talk to, and certainly the work which we did previously with Barkinghaven and Redbridge Trust. So trying to run a group model in 2 separate trusts, as opposed to what I've essentially got as a very large merged organisation, but operating as a group.
So yours is a group of functions as opposed to a group of statutory organisations, as we've heard in an earlier podcast with Glenn Burley, where he has, a similar amount of hospital spaces, but they're separate organisations. Yours is a group of functions, isn't it, in that respect?
Yeah. And if you look at this, using Glenn's example is a good one. So if you look at sort of accountability for finances, performance, etc., these unmerged trusts will still have to report individual trust performance. Ours is just a straight lens on Barts Health, which has got its pros and its cons, it must be said, because obviously things can get lost in a much bigger thing. But in terms of accountability, it's a lot more straightforward for the regulators.
And how long is it since, say, you've actually merged the 3 hospital trusts into one Barts Health? How long is that ago now?
So it was in the ether for quite a while, but basically 2012 was the sort of time that it was all brought together. And it was a tough initial start. I mean, I've only been here since 2018. And I came as the deputy CEO. So I've been group CEO now for nearly coming up to 3 years. So 2012, and then its kind of low point, Barts Health, was in special measures back in 2015, which was when Dame Allen was brought in and essentially changed the model a lot to what a large chunk of what you still see today.
Given you've been there for a long period in that, I mean, just when we think about merged organizations, how long do you think it kind of takes for that merged approach to kind of yield into one approach? So we are all parts of Barts Health, or indeed, have you still got remnants of, I don't know, I'm still Whips Cross. I'm quite proud. I'm separate.
It's a really good point. So I think it's an ongoing journey, these things, because what I want people to say is, oh, I work at Whips Cross Hospital, but I'm part of Barts Health and proud to be so. So you kind of want both. I want a local identity because actually our model is based on local vertical leadership that makes sense to staff and patients in the patch they work in. And most of my hospital CEOs are also the place-based leader or co-leader in their borough. But I want them to identify to a broader piece around Barts Health and the group bringing benefits at an aggregate of scale. And, it's sticking to the original David Dalton premise on this stuff around reducing variation, standardizing practice, being more efficient by running things from the center, but devolving as much as we can locally.
And that is, and I mean, to be honest, that's the balance every organization have, whether they're your size or whether they're smaller or even bigger, is how you get that balance of I recognize my local, whatever your local is. It could be a set of kind of tertiary services almost, but actually I'm part of something else. So when you explain that, say to a new member of staff or say to someone who comes in to kind of look at you, what do you describe as the important elements of Bart Health providing that umbrella for those kind of 5 sites?
Yeah, so kind of describe in a couple of ways. So what are the components of the group? So there's at central to our group is hospital leadership, those vertical hospital operating units. That's kind of one component. And then we've got, so that, if you like, that's sort of like 4 vertical pillars. And then coming across, we've got 2 things really. So one is we've got clinical networks and clinical boards that look to drive up standards and clinical variation, drive down variation, not up, across the group. So you've got a vertical hospital piece, then you've got things like orthopedics, ENT, whatever coming across from a clinical network perspective. Also coming across and sort of supporting underneath, you've got group support services. So we keep things central, like, recruitment, central finance, payroll, information technology, informatics, that sort of stuff centrally as a supporting nest. And then across the top of that, you've kind of got group leadership, which is trying to do the setting and communicating vision, setting the values, strategic direction, and holding the component parts then to account for delivery. And that's the trade-off. Now, the group leadership, of course, is not a regulator. It doesn't regulate in the way that we would get held to account by NHS England and things like that. It's also not only asks, well, kind of what's going on with this, but also what support or help might you need. So as I say, it's a combination of that. And sorry, the last point I should make for rounding too much is that it's very much a matrix model outside of the hospitals. The hospital's pretty straightforward. There's a CEO, executive team, they've got their divisions, they run the hospitals day to day, performance, quality, finance, safety, etc. But at the group level, there's a kind of complicated matrix. So people have to be able to work in systems that they don't directly line manage those components and to get those efficiencies and benefits across the group at scale.
And so those are, I guess, and I don't know in your experience, but some of those things are harder to do on a horizontal level, aren't they? So to, let's pick an uncontentious area. I don't know, orthopedics and anesthesia. No, let's not go down that route. But if we chose that, how do you get the benefit of saying, what are we doing on the Newnham side? What are we doing on the Whips Cross side? What are we doing on the Mile End side? You're kind of almost asking people to voluntarily be part of a greater mass to improve things, I guess, because it's not a direct line of you must do this type of thing.
Yeah, so take our clinical networks. We want those to be responsible for developing the strategy, setting the standards, reducing variation for whatever specialty that is. It is something we're actually interestingly something we're trying to evolve, and what we were trying to get beyond here is just three hospitals talking about orthopedics and working collegiately, which they, to be quite frank, they do. It's the bit beyond that, and taking that sort of, if you almost like the Tim Briggs getting it right first time approach. So what would the very best in class look like here in orthopedics to the standards? Obviously, as a part of a merged group, it's a bit easier in terms of mutual aid, shared capacity, patient choice, moving around the system. And we can be a bit selective about capacity. So in some of these specialties, we've got more happening at one hospital than another to complement. So, for example, Newham has the Barts Health Orthopaedic Centre, where the lion's share of the HVLC work is done. Royal London tends to have the complex end of that pathway. So we don't always get this right. And to be honest with you, it's the area in the group model that we found hardest to maintain, because it's all based on clinical time. How much can we support people with the right management support and sort of bandwidth that goes with that.
But then that's the fascinating aspect, isn't it? Because even if you were separate organizations, you'd want to get that alignment. And as you're saying, it's tough to prioritize that even when they're under your same fold and the same authority almost. So there's an issue in there in how we sustain that improvement across anywhere. So earlier you touched on then broadening your group, which you did a few years ago to cover another organization, so you had an even more complex approach. So and that's kind of unraveled since and gone back to a different set of arrangements. So just tell the people listening a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when I was appointed, I was the group CEO and accountable officer for both Barts Health and Barkinghaven and Redbridge NHS Trust, which is a trust probably known to many listeners, that's had a lot of trouble over many, many years in outer northeast London. It's a big trust. It's probably about 800 million turnover in its own right. Huge hospital in Queens and a smaller hospital at King George's, but 2 EDs, busy maternities, lots of things going on there. And essentially, Barts Health was asked to help, if you like, I'll use the word help, use some of the success from the group model experience here to support across BHRT, and essentially they were in special measures and trying to drive up things on the financial side, but also on key performance things, particularly in UEC. They're always quite good surgically. So that was the kind of vibe, and hence Jackie Smith, the Right Honourable Jackie Smith, was appointed as chair in common across the two trusts, and I was then appointed as the joint chief exec. But a bit like we described earlier with the other models, remaining two statutory organisations and trying to collaborate at a group level. So that was the plan. And to be fair, somewhat through the help that Barts Health put into it, some infrastructure support, sort of human resource support and leadership support, clinical and otherwise, plus some great work by Matthew Traynor and the team over at BHR, things started to improve. And I think there was a sense then that actually, as always with the NHS, things move quite quickly, don't they? So at this same stage, things were evolving in terms of the system working, the nature of the acute provider collaboratives, and particularly the acute provider collaborative in North East London is basically Barts and BHRT. There's only one other acute trust, and that's the Homerton in City and Hackney, a well-performing but a small trust, probably about the size of Whipps Cross Hospital. And the sense was, rather than pursue kind of an agenda that eventually brought the two trusts together formally, that we're better at collaborating through that acute provider collaborative network. And that's what was agreed. And hence the new chair of Barts Health after Jackie Smith was tapped on the shoulder to join the House of Lords and the new government, was to have separate chairs and separate AOs, but the chair to signify this relationship, the chair of Barts Health to chair the acute provider collaborative, and the chief exec of Barts Health, i.e. me, to be kind of first among equals with those three chief execs in the system. So the model kind of evolved. And I think reflecting nationally, there probably wasn't much appetite to go for some sort of huge, bearing in mind Barts Health was already, as I say, 2.5 billion turnover, it would make it the biggest trust in the UK by some distance. So I think things had evolved, and also there'd been some good improvements at BHR. And the sense was we could probably get more out of working without disrupting further structurally through the APC.
And how much had you actually bound the infrastructure together that therefore made it harder or easier to unpack that when you decided to be less formal?
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
No, great question. So we hadn't gone so far to merge up many functions deliberately, because I think that was never the intention. It was more about the way we could work at leadership level, but there were some functions we had brought together, and also with areas where staff from both trusts were saying, well, don't hold us back, we want to collaborate, and they still do. So probably the obvious example is BHRT is literally the last trust in London to have a proper electronic patient record. So our guys from here are still working with them to implement our instance of Oracle Cerner at BHR. So there's quite a huge join up there. Other areas, so I went to the staff networks meeting the other day, and both Barts and BHR networks are still working together. So no, there's been no problem, I think, around things that have gone too far having to be unraveled, which is a good thing.
I presume, therefore, it doesn't preclude also that you might want to tie things up more formally later on. I mean, you've separated to an extent, you've distanced yourself from an extent, but actually you've, as you say, you're still collaborating and you still want to do things together. So I guess it's wait and see what that brings in your collaboration.
Exactly. And NHS England would be quite clear about this. They're saying that we don't think this is the vehicle any longer, but we think there is a need for a vehicle, and that is the acute provider collaborative. And we're expecting you to work together through that. And so far that's been working quite well. We've picked a smaller number of work streams that are going to have more impact for all three trusts.
When you talk about that acute collaboration, which you've now gone into with the Homerton, with BHRT and yourselves, that then becomes much more about we have to choose to do this and we have to choose to do something different, because it's absolutely a choice. Separate organizations can do something else. How has that altered for you? You're accountable officer for 2 out of 3 of those previously, and now you're leading that through a different approach. What's that been like compared to what it was before?
Well, interestingly, it's probably a bit simpler than it was before. It was being AO for 2 organizations. I'm sure colleagues have said this to you, that actually are not merged operationally and don't have the same operational units and functions I've got at Barts Health. So we couldn't treat BHRT like a 5th hospital version, which would have been far easier if we could. So interestingly, the simplicity of the separate AOs makes more sense. Where it is more complex, and you've touched on this, is that getting things done through consensus is much more important. So I've tried to, and Matthew at BHRT and Baz at the Homerton have been pretty good here, actually, trying to find areas where it's in everyone's interest to pursue specialty X or corporate function Y. But not all cases have to be win-win-win. If no one's worse off, but it works for the other trusts, that's a case worth exploring. If it's going to make it worse for 2 trusts and better for one, well, that's probably not a case worth exploring. So we've kind of had a more of a principled discussion. So we've picked 2 or 3 specialties, things like ENT, gynae, where there's problems right across the board for all trusts, and corporate areas where we're all trying to do more with less to keep up with the whole financial juggernaut. And the obvious thing being finally we just signed off a formal procurement partnership across all 3 trusts, bringing those 3 departments together and hosted through Barts Health.
Great. And so that presumably will yield benefit. Is that erudite, and is that clear enough for you to really say, for Barts Health, to be able to say, yeah, we know that's a delivery vehicle rather than just a collaboration? I had someone talking to me earlier who talked about partnership boards as if, and saying, sometimes they're just fluffy word fora. This sounds purposeful, outcome driven. You want to actually deliver things here.
Yeah, and the 3 chairs and 3 chief execs have been quite clear, hence picking 5 or 6 things only and doing them properly, as opposed to a larger list of things that are all very interesting. So it's much more focused, I think, and with focus, I think, makes it a bit easier. The fact we've got some kind of buy-in across all 3 trusts, and there's focus and a bit of resource behind it to make it happen, is helpful.
And just because the chair of Homerton is my ex-chair, Mary,
Yes, yes.
I presume she will have already said to you, you've got to deliver for children as well as adults. I presume you've had that conversation by now,
We have
Shane.
across the whole board. Children's are an important component of the joint working, of
Very
course.
good. She's only been there a short time. It's good to see her how her involvement already making dividends in that respect. Well done, Mary, because I know she'll be listening to this. So tell me, how hard was it to unravel the arrangements with BHRT? Because you were at the center of that. It was fairly high profile with a really big political figure who has now joined the current government, the Labour government. Was that a tough process, or?
It was tough at both ends. I think it was tough for people at Barts Health in particular because we'd spent a long time persuading them this was in the broader interest of the system. We're one NHS, we're maybe separate organisations, all the things you'd expect me to say, which I actually believe. So there was I think it was kind of tough as people that had put a lot of time and personal effort into things. The actual transactional bit of it was quite straightforward because we'd never actually merged the trusts, and so essentially it was a nature of turning, stopping some of these. Well, in fact, we didn't stop them, morphing some of these joint committees and joint arrangements. In fact, we morphed them more into the way the APC, the Acute Provider Collaborative, worked. And then, of course, once Jackie had stepped into the government, and the decision was taken not to reappoint with a joint chair, things kind of just fell relatively quickly into that. And Matthew and I had established a great working relationship over the previous several years, and Matthew Trainer said it was no problem really to think through how we would do it. As I say, it was more of the fact that there was a sense that some areas, I mean, I'm sure some areas are probably secretly delighted that happened, but a much larger group of people were. It's always disappointed we weren't pursuing things because actually there's been a lot of good dialogue across the trust, and we've tried to just capture that and keep it going where it makes sense.
I guess the simplistic thing was you were no longer accountable officer, and Matthew stood into the accountable officer, and you switched out. Because I regularly, when I talk to people about leadership, the chief exec role is both functional and statutorily. The accountable officer part of it can be done by one person, as you have done over multiple organisations. So, yeah, relatively easy. And
of course, just on that point, it was relatively easy for me because I've relinquished that. But at the same time, if you like, took up that more formality or the more formal piece through the Acute Provider Collaborative. So it was almost felt like I was trading one for the other, even though they weren't the same.
And just on last thing on this particular area, people. I know, ironically, I'm doing this podcast series on organisational structure and how things work, but people do obsess with structure, don't they? They obsess with what the organisations are. So your point earlier was, people are upset that we unravelled it, but actually, what you just described to me was probably more of an evolution into a broader approach that probably brought the Homerton into a broader family of collaboration, whereas they could have been separate to that previously.
Yeah, and I think a part of this is, and I'll chat to, this is nothing I've not said in forums here, but, in some ways, there's three sovereign organisations in the acute environment here. There's the Homerton, there's Barts Health, there's BHIET. And, in some ways, the price for that is we have to behave with each other like we're not. And that, what I mean by that is that the management teams, leadership teams work together, clinicians talk across pathways, and crucially, the patients get, the offer, if you like, of services across those hospitals, should they choose so, or should we want to do that to make it easier for them to access for waiting times or whatever else. And so that, if you can sort of get some of those principles established, it makes it a little bit easier, I think, to work together.
Because you essentially say, well, let's put what's right for our North London residents and North East London residents, and we'll do the change in structurally to achieve that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So now just got one job, life's a breeze, 24,000 staff, £2.5 billion worth of public taxpayers' money, he says in tongue in cheek. Tell people who are listening, what's it like leading that approach when you're leading through other really senior, very experienced chief exec teams, and they sit there. I'm looking at you on screen. This is going to be audio, and I can see a lovely polished desk behind which the Barts polisher has been, at hand. What's it like to lead that as a group chief exec?
So honestly, it's like any chief exec job. It's got its roller coaster moments, isn't it? Its highs and its lows. The highs are quite high, the lows are quite low. But honestly, it's a real privilege to lead this organization. I like several things about it. One, I love the fact that it's so varied. I've got hospitals that at all ends of the kind of patient experience market, if you like, from the very top end of the sort of quaternary services, let alone tertiary, to the sort of stuff that I would need or my family needs in the DGH and community services. So it's got a real mix. I love the variety. So that's probably one thing. Secondly, like anywhere that you've worked, it's the people you work with, the experience that you have, and a huge piece of work was done here by my predecessor around values, behaviours, culture, which we know I've kept on. Obviously, I was part of that. So that sort of respectful, accountable yet respectful place to work, and for our population in East London, which is obviously hugely diverse, that inclusion, equity, mirroring our population is really important to me and to what we do here. So that's the second thing. I think if I think back to my previous chief exec role, I was 6 years as CEO of Hillingdon Hospitals, FT in West London, which is a kind of medium-sized DGH. But I could wrap my hands around that. I could walk around there each day at my office, and I knew most of the staff. And you can't do that at Barts Health. The scale is huge, so you have to really plan your. So I'm trying to be in a different hospital every day, and that most days I try and get out and walk about and talk to someone somewhere. Beyond the sort of structured visits that we do, obviously through the board and everything else. So I love the variety. I love the people. It's a challenge, obviously, working in the trusted scale, but I need to remember to myself, I've got CEOs and they've got teams in each hospital. So my job is not to run the operations at Whipps Cross. There's a team of people doing that. My job is to make it easier for them to do that through group collaboration, also the work we do on the broader system.
And is that the sweet spot in leadership for you, that you're providing the opportunities by the benefit of the group, capabilities, capacity to deliver change for each of those chief executives and those execs, and then you basically get out of their way and let them do their job?
Yeah, you've got to create the environment basically for them to flourish, either by working together inside the hospital group that I control, or with more often with the system partners outside of the hospital trust, and obviously with our huge research and academic partners such as Queen Mary's, life sciences. There's a whole lot going on in that zone. Big work with Barts Charity. So there's a huge piece to kind of connect this up. But yeah, it's fundamentally making their life easier to deliver what they need to do.
And does that mean your job as a chief exec, group chief exec, is pretty external? It's joining the dots. I think I've just heard you mention academia. I've heard you mention research. The commercial sector. And is it also, I think I'm hearing quite a lot on leadership development, coaching, supporting people to be effective in their role. I mean, those are two big parts of your role?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the answer to that question is broadly yes. But of course,
the but, yeah.
The but bit, of course, is what it's like, and so are your listeners and colleagues doing similar jobs, is that the pressure on the NHS from the political world and other things, not unreasonably, I might add, is about delivery of today, performance, money, safety, quality. So, and those things are quite, obviously we need a strategic approach to those, but, I have to understand what's happening in UEC, in A&E at Whipps Cross today. If I don't, I'll be perceived as not having a grip on what's happening in the organisation. So I need systems to do that. What's happening with long waiting patients, what's happening with diagnostics. So again, a strategic approach, but enough grip of the operational detail, because I think that's what's expected. So it does drag you back into a more day-to-day piece, but I do try to stick to the areas that you described earlier on where I can.
And how have you described being chief exec in Hillingdon Hospital? You then came over to the group and you've worked your way through and now group exec. Have you found you've needed to adapt your skills and style in terms of what you're now doing.
Yeah, definitely. So I was CEO. By the way, I'm a physiotherapist by background. I should have said that. So I came up through management, through to management from physiotherapy and therapies. So I couldn't have, I think, done this job coming straight from my single site, if you like, job at Hillingdon. I think the time I came here as deputy CEO for the group taught me a lot about how groups work, particularly how you get the best working through and with others. That's not I didn't have to do that when I was at Hillingdon, but it was quite a different style about it. So largely what works here is that connectivity and getting things done. And I say this to the group executive directors here a lot, is that quite often they've got levers that they can't pull because that they some of the levers might have come off their hand, literally. Yes, like, no, someone else needs to do that, but you have to enable that to happen. So that's the biggest.
I think we've got a Secretary of State who is realising that his levers doesn't quite attach to anything, haven't we?
Indeed.
Not that I'm equating you to be the same as that, Shane, but
Yeah, it's tricky. So that's the main thing about working in a group. And what I say to people is that, and because obviously people come here, I was worried. Everyone's worried about coming to a group like Barts because they say the scale is really difficult to scale. And say, well, but that's going to be a problem for anyone coming to a trust this size, similar to some other ones in the country that are of this scale. Anyone's going to have to adapt to it.
And so, if you're having to get used to that thing of a lever you pull is not going to directly change things, and I would argue it's never that simple anyway, is it? Because otherwise life would be so much simpler for all, or slightly worrying, I'd imagine as well, if it was that easy. But we'll just go with the analogy. What did you learn? What are those skills that you learned as a group deputy chief exec that's allowed you to then flourish in this chief exec role that was perhaps different to your uni hospital site job?
Yeah, so I think because my brief as deputy CEO, apart from being a deputy, broadly, I was also the kind of the chief operating officer. And the best example was that, I was basically sitting at the board, accountable and reporting for operational constitutional standard delivery. But the person who was responsible at the hospital for doing that was the chief exec. And of course, in my old job, they didn't report to me. They reported to the group CEO.
Yeah.
So it was very tricky when things weren't going to plan. So I found a lot more one-to-one dialogue, that mix of what would help, but kind of what are you doing? And then finish up with, what can I do to help without trying to enable someone, trying to do someone else's job for them. So it's kind of a lot more about empowering. That was the main thing. How do I empower someone? Because we're mutually accountable for this. It's in my interest that this chap, whoever it is, or woman, delivers. And how can I help them with that?
Yeah.
At the same time, I've got my boss, the group CEO, and the chairman saying, well, what's going on?
Yeah. And that points at you because you're on the board accountable for that.
Indeed.
Yeah. These are tough dynamics and have to learn how to deal with them, which makes me think about our future leaders, because you said, just the beginning of that, it would have been quite hard to jump from being a single site chief exec to then suddenly become the group, because you have to learn how to do things differently. How are you thinking that our future chief execs, the future group chief exec, how are we going to learn? Because I spoke to the aspiring chief exec 2 cohorts recently, and one of their questions was, there's lots less people like Shane. He's hoovering up, or his organizations have, there used to be 3 chief execs, now there's 1. It's stopping our opportunity. So what's your take on succession? What's your take on developing the next cadre of leaders?
Yeah, so great example. So when I first was appointed at Hillingdon as chief exec, there were 7 or 8 acute hospital CEOs in Northwest London. By the time I left, there was 4, and I was one of them. Yeah. So this is not a new. This is what's happening. I've done a few cohorts. I'm currently supporting cohort 6 of the aspiring chief exec program, and we've had this exact discussion. My main bit of advice to them is, if they've not worked in a big trust before, a really big mega trust, these hospital CEO jobs, if they're properly set up, are great jobs to get on your way to becoming an accountable officer in big trust. Don't have to do it that way, but you're going to get 2 things, aren't you? Basically, you'll be working as an equivalent of a CEO, without the AO status. Now that bothers some people, but those that have been AOs will tell you that doesn't really matter. You're going to feel accountable no matter whether you got the label or not. And those are great jobs to do things. One, to sort of cut your teeth as a CEO without the full gamut of accountability. And secondly, you'll understand more how these large groups work, so that when that job presents itself, you'll be well pitched to get it. And more importantly, you'll be well pitched to then actually do it and deliver it. Because I often worry sometimes the issue is not getting the job, it's being able to deliver it and sustain it.
I had that conversation with, probably it could have been the same Kaja. I was like, just also don't be in a rush.
Yeah, it's no
job. Choose wisely. These roles are really hard, so do it well and choose the right place. But also, if you're not doing that, if you're not mirroring that behavior now, just becoming a chief exec won't help you mirror that behavior and do, as you just said, do the job well, because it's a tough thing to do. And I think that's a nice distinction, isn't it, about being a hospital-based or a community or a mental health or whatever else, managing director or chief executive versus the accountable officer on the board. Those are different things.
Yeah.
And one comes with a different set of responsibilities and accountability than the other.
And I think that's right. But in our group, and so at the moment, so unlike when I first started here, so my 4 hospital CEOs are all on our trust board.
Yeah.
So the example I gave about me being the coup and having to defend for the whole, that's what happened now. Now we say, well, the Royal London chief exec's here, he can explain himself, type of thing. Even though you've got dual accountability. But so literally, you're on the trust board. You're accountable for a very large operational unit. You're the place-based leader, or if you're not, you're certainly part of that place-based team, leadership team. You've got exposure to non-executives. Okay, fine. You haven't probably got the full gamut of exposure to, say, the chairman directly that you would have on a unitary board or a council of governors if you were doing that thing. But apart from that, you're doing a large chunk of the components of a normal CEO job. So that, I think, well, I mean, I'm biased, obviously. I think these are great jobs to get on the way up to these big jobs.
Yeah. And some will argue, no offense to all the chairs I've worked with, including my current, what's not to like in that respect, dot.
Yes.
Yeah. Just as we kind of pull this to a close, Shane, because it's been fascinating listening how this has all developed and you developed and work. What's exciting? What kicks Mr. DeGaris out of bed in the morning? Apart from the things you've already said, you clearly love your people. You clearly love the hustle and bustle of your different sites, your communities, etc. But what's making you excited and thinking, yeah, this is good to tough out for the next X of months and years?
It's a great question, isn't it? And it's hard to stay. I think this last 3 to 6 months in particular, with the sort of the huge pressure back on money again. I mean, not that money ever went away, but the sort of the overtness of it is making things quite difficult. So I'm trying hard to stay motivated around what some of the transformation and innovation opportunities, as opposed to what's the cost cutting approach we can take to get through the next 6 to 12 months. So I really think that there's a chance, and particularly in our patch through our APC, but also I think as the 10-year plan comes out, there's going to be a license, I think, to operate more in the space of, probably these accountable care pieces, how we're going to work together really to get back to this population health concept, which is kind of what I was wedded to when I started it. And I remember chatting to the ICB chief executive about this, that, what we really want to do is better focus our efforts, resource and human resource and financial resource on this huge health inequalities position we've got in the patch of the world we operate in. Now, in order to do that, we'll need the bandwidth, the executive bandwidth and board bandwidth to do that. But we also need conditions where, hospitals are really incentivized to shift work and resource out. Just saying that the work should shift, but it still comes, that doesn't really help. So that's the space I want to get into. How can we transform? How can we innovate? How can we be population health focused? I'm not precious at all about this kind of scale or size of Barts Health. It should be a boon or benefit to the population, not a hindrance to it.
Yeah. which is fascinating, isn't it? Because we eagerly await. This was recorded where we await the 10-year plan, which is the new NHS 10-year plan. We wait spending review in a week or so's time, which will set the government spending. And as you say, there's only a certain amount of cost restriction you can do. You have to do something quite different if you're going to live and become. And the Norfolk world that I operate in as well, we talk about being a lower cost care delivery system. We have to do things through lower cost, and that's everything you just described, isn't it? But that's a tough thing to pull off.
Yeah, and I'm happy to provide. Yeah, end of the day, there's a lot of taxpayer money being spent here. I'm happy to spend less and have it to better effect. That's no problem. It's the enabling of that. I think that's the key. How we work it through together.
Yeah, it's doing it. So Shane, you've talked fabulously about your five hospitals, your 24,000 staff, which we won't test you on, how you became a deputy chief exec, moved into this group role over Barts Health. You've gone through iterations of working with BHRT that come to an end. You lead the acute collaboration. Thought it was very telling about you want to get the vertical accountability, but the benefits of that kind of horizontal across your sites, clinical networks drive out variation that actually helps people to develop, that enables them to be best in class, because that's what we're all about. And being a group chief exec is an absolute privilege. It's about the people. It's about making things different. It's making the environment right for them to flourish, I think is what you said, because I wrote it down because I thought it was a good thing. You've said that before, I think, in that respect. I can hear that coming out. And you talked about, Shane, how you've had to alter your style and be a slightly different person, but also that person who's going to do something different for the next period where things are tough in UK PLC, but we still need to deliver great care. Shane, it's been a delight listening to you and getting an insight into Barts Health and the North East London world. And thank you for spending time with us on leadership and culture in healthcare.
Matthew, thank you. Very much enjoyed the conversation and excellent summary there at the end. Couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you.
Thanks.